Hello, this is the Religion, Peace and Conflict revision PowerPoint. It goes alongside the booklet and also the summary sheet that you've already worked on. So I'm just going to talk through each area. Obviously feel free to pause, have a look over your booklet, fill it in as you go, and also use it alongside the textbook for a little bit more detail. Okay, so this is just looking over the key concepts and really the sort of key terms, the red boxes in the textbook as well. So just have a look over those key terms that you should have possibly in the booklet, but also as a separate sheet of just key terms to know. A lot of these we are going to begin to go through in detail now. So as a bit of background, before we look at conflict, we're going to focus on the idea of peace. Many religions talk about a time of peace. It could be the idea of in the afterlife, heaven or paradise. It could be a goal to reach, or it could be the idea of peace on earth right now. So the definition of peace is to live in harmony without fear. And an interesting way of looking at war and its intention is to actually create peace once it's over. So a few teachings on peace from Christianity and Islam. Now there are a lot of quotes here, so just pick out a couple for each that may be useful for many areas. So Jesus said, "Blessed are the peacemakers. Love your enemies and pray for those that hurt you. Turn the other cheek." That idea, if someone strikes you on one cheek, turn the other. The idea of don't retaliate. And that's a useful quote that we'll come back to. Also, do not repay evil with evil. If possible, live at peace with everyone. And again, for retaliation, that's quite a good quote. Some good points from Islam. The word Islam comes from a word meaning peace. Also, one of Allah's 99 names is source of peace. And a couple of quotes are, if they incline towards peace, you must incline towards it. And when aggressive people address you, reply with words of peace. So quite a similar message with Islam and Christianity, the idea of not repaying with violence and seeking peace. So in your booklet, there is mention of conflict. So just before we talk about justice, just as a mention, before any armed conflict or fighting begins, there is some form of conflict, like a disagreement. In Christianity, religious people often aim to resolve those disagreements before it becomes war. And for some, they feel the need to get involved. One example is Dietrich Bonhoeffer, and we'll come on to him in a couple of slides' time. And that's where you can fill in this space to say what he did as a Christian. Now, looking at justice, the term justice means fairness. Religions try to fight injustice. And many wars are about an abuse of injustice. And so people feel a duty about to fight against it. If you look at, for example, Britain being involved in World War II, the point was to stop the injustice and abuse of human rights that went on. So justice is also linked to equality. If people are not given the same opportunities, it can be seen as unfair. So a few points on justice. And also this does link to the first topic with Christianity about the qualities of God. So for Islam, the just one is one of Allah's 99 names. Also, God has provided laws because they bring justice on earth. Injustice is a fault of humans. God's laws should produce justice. And something we'll look at in a bit more detail later on is that war must always have a just or a fair cause, which is called lesser jihad, part one of their conditions. Christians will fight for justice in a just war, so a war which is seen as being fair or right. And again, we'll look at this in more detail in a moment. And another quote which goes back to that first topic on the qualities of God, let justice roll like a river. So if we also look at the religious views on reconciliation, and this is the idea of resolving conflict and restoring relationships. It's something that people can do with God and also with each other. So most religions were involved in this after war, so trying to reconcile the differences. We'll come on to the idea of pacifism in a moment, and Quakers are a group of Christians who are pacifists, and they will try to bring both sides together after war. So then for Christianity, so Quakers believe that reconciliation and conflicts can be resolved without war, so they don't believe in fighting. A really good example on reconciliation, which we looked at, and it's in the textbook for the first topic of with Christianity, so the second topic is on the idea of Christians and reconciliation with each other. So Coventry Cathedral is a centre of reconciliation. When the cathedral was bombed, instead of looking for further conflict or blame, the community got together and chose to forgive. Lots of symbolism within the cathedral show that. And what they do is they create crosses made out of nails, and they send it to places where there's conflict in the world to show that there's a centre of reconciliation and that they're praying for them and trying to help them towards reconciliation. Also, in both Christianity and Islam, making up after a conflict involves more than just words. So both sides must play an active part in trying to resolve and restore their relationship. And so similar to this, we've got the idea of forgiveness. And this is the idea we should move the relationship forward with someone who has done wrong with us. We should forgive them. We should accept their apology. And that is central in Christianity. With the crime topic, we looked at the example of G. Walker, Anthony Walker's mum. And that's a really, really good example to focus on Christianity and forgiveness. So a few points from Christianity is Christians believe that forgiveness is important in order to live peacefully. It's also taught, forgive us our sins as we forgive those who sin against us, which is part of the Lord's Prayer. So it's asking, forgive us in the same way that we forgive others. So if we don't forgive others, then we're asking not to be forgiven as well. And when Jesus was asked, how many times should I forgive? He says, forgive your brother 70 times 7 times. This idea of actually endlessly is the message of that. In Islam, no one should bear a grudge after conflict. Action should be taken to establish justice once forgiveness has taken place. Also, God sets the example of forgiveness by offering it to all who ask in faith. And this last quote is really useful, particularly in this war topic and peace and conflict. Hate your enemy mildly, for he may one day become your friend. So we've got an example of forgiveness, which is within the textbook as well, Corrie ten Boom. And she's a really good example, alongside G. Walker, of somebody who looked to forgiveness. And she said, when he tells us to love our enemies, he gives along with the command the love itself. This idea of love your enemies is a tough idea, and she gives a really good example of this. So she was a Christian Dutch girl, and she helped to save Jewish lives in Holland in World War II. Her father and sister were killed by the Nazis, but she managed to escape. Many years later, she saw one of the concentration camp guards in church. He held out his hand. All of her memories flooded back, and even though she would preach about forgiveness, her anger grew. She prayed to God to help to forgive him, and when she held her hand out, she felt the agape love from Jesus flow like a current from her to him, and she believed that this meant that all rifts are healed by God's love. It's not the idea that forgiveness is easy, it's the idea that without God she didn't feel she could forgive, and she felt that agape love from Jesus helped her to do that. So she's a really good example that you could use when talking about forgiveness, particularly when we're thinking of victims of war and conflict. So going back to the idea of religious teachings on conflict, there is a link to a video on Dietrich Bonhoeffer. Now, he was a pacifist, somebody who didn't believe in violence, but he was a Christian living in the time of Hitler, and he saw what was going on and felt that he had to do something. And so his quote here at the top sort of explains that. Silence in the face of evil is itself evil. And so he actually helped to plot to kill Hitler, and he was killed. He was found and killed for plotting that. So if we move on to the idea of protesting, and not necessarily in a war context, but just in general. So in the UK, it's a freedom within the democracy to protest peacefully in public to demonstrate your point of view. And it's worth noting the term peacefully should probably be highlighted there. Peaceful protest is fine to share your view, to demonstrate. It may involve a march, and you must let the police know 6 days in advance, because it depends on what you're standing for and whether it can cause conflict. And so they may have to cancel it or be involved in some way if they feel it might turn violent. So protesting is fine, it's allowed. An example of peaceful protest, the best example we could maybe use, which also would bring us onto the human rights topic as an example, is Martin Luther King. So this example can work for both of these topics. So his non-violent protests about racial and social inequality were during America's civil rights movement. He used methods like the bus boycott, so refusing to use buses. It wasn't violent, but it did make a difference because the bus companies ended up sort of going bankrupt because they weren't having the funds, and eventually, after more than a year, they changed their rules. And the idea of sit-ins, so black and white people sitting together inside a restaurant at tables peacefully, which they weren't allowed to do. Eventually, it was a slow process, but they were successful in gaining equal rights legislation. So peaceful protests are allowed. And as I say, the idea that they can have a huge impact, this is a really good example to support that. If we look towards violent protesting, it's illegal. And in the UK, in 2011, there were the London riots. They began as an unplanned protest because a man was shot dead in Tottenham. Now, some people began to protest, but what happened after there, it escalated all across the country. And in major cities, people were looting shops, smashing windows, rioting, causing criminal damage, setting fire to bins, throwing things at the police. It was a huge protest, huge violence in the end. So what began peacefully then led to violent protest, and many people were taken to court over that. So some religious teachings then on violent protest. I know there's not a huge amount of space in the booklet, so just feel free to pick and choose some quotes, and some of these we've already looked at. So in Christianity, it teaches non-violence. Jesus said, "Blessed are the peacemakers." He taught, "Turn the other cheek." However, you could use an argument to say that God gave us free will. And if our peaceful protests are ignored, maybe somebody will resort to violence in order to be heard. So that's a point that's worth noting. In Islam, Islam means peace. Everybody should act peacefully. However, violence could be used if it's in self-defense. And Muslims have a duty to protest against injustice. Again, it's not about violence, but there's a duty to protest against what they see as injustice. If we move on to the idea of terrorism, the definition is a serious form of violent protest. And this is when an individual or a group will use terror to further their cause. They will target civilians in public with methods like car bombs and suicide bombers. They may think that if they make society aware of their cause and frighten them enough, the public will put pressure on authorities to give way to their demands. Sometimes it could be based on an idea, an ideal, or something they want done. Now, it's really important to note that all religions are against terrorism. So a few religious views on this. Even though they may associate themselves with a religion, no religion supports terrorism. So sometimes when we think about the media, certain things that go on, we hear of groups of terrorists associating or individuals associating themselves with a religious idea. And it's really important to note that no religion supports this. In Christianity, Christians consider terrorist acts of violence as wrong. They prefer peace to resolve issues. And there will be lots of teachings that you could use to sort of argue against violence. In Islam, Muslims do not agree with terrorism. Acts are against the wishes of God, and there is no justification for terrorism within the teachings of Islam. So those are some points that are really worth noting. So we're going to come on to a few reasons for war. So some of the causes of war, and they may include greed, self-defense, retaliation, to gain resources like oil, or to remove a dictator. So we're going to focus on just a few of these examples. So firstly, greed. Greed can lead countries to invade others for resources like oil. This way, rich countries become more rich and powerful, whilst the defeated country may become poor. So Christian views on this. Christianity warns against greed, and the Bible teaches the love of money is the root of all evil. Now, this is a quote that's really useful within the human rights topic as well. And it's worth noting the love of money is the root of all evil, not money itself. So that idea linking it to greed, sort of wanting more. In Islam, the Quran warns against greed. It says God does not like arrogant, boastful people. Another reason for war is self-defense. And obviously, when we look at views on war, it's not always just agree and disagree. That could be based on the reasons that war has happened. So most people would say fighting in self-defense is morally acceptable. They believe they have a right to defend the values, beliefs and the way of life that their country has, and they'll defend that. So during World War II, the UK had to defend themselves against the Nazis. As well as fighting to defend their own country, many people will fight to support other nations that are also under threat. So for many people, we'll come on to religious arguments on war, but for many, self-defense would be a good reason for it. So for Christianity, if all of the methods have failed, Christians might support fighting for self-defense. And in Islam, it's permitted in the Quran, but again, only if all the other methods have failed. So rather than resorting to violence, could you try and resolve the conflict beforehand? And the last example we'll look at for a reason of war is retaliation. So wars can be fought in retaliation when a country is seen to have something, seem to have done something wrong. So a case study would be after the 9/11 attacks, the US ordered military action against Afghanistan. They felt that they were providing shelter for Al-Qaeda. Although many people thought it was a necessary response after that act of terrorism, it was seen as an unwelcome act of retaliation by many. So if we look at self-defense and retaliation, there are very different views on when it's right. So Christianity, Jesus and the Bible teach against retaliation. Jesus said, turn the other cheek. And in Romans it says, do not repay anyone evil with evil. In Islam, retaliation is permitted in the Quran. It teaches that, though, forgiveness is the best response. But sometimes retaliation may be needed to protect human life. Retaliation must also be measured, So if you have to respond, make sure it's proportionate. And that will bring us on to the idea of just war and lesser jihad in a little bit. So an example of conflict. So we know examples such as World War I, World War II, but another example is the Falklands War. And this is British territory off the coast of Argentina. Argentinian forces invaded as they believed the islands should belong to them. So British forces went in to defend the territory. So a couple of facts around it. It started in April 1982 and lasted for 78 days. Overall, 907 lives were lost from both sides, along with several civilians. So that's just one example, and I believe that's in the textbook too, that you can look into. So a couple of things we'll be looking at are the ideas of religious views on when war's okay. So a just war in Christianity or lesser jihad in Islam. Slightly separate to that, we've got the idea of holy war. So this really, a lot of what we look at with holy war, we can go back to the Crusades for this. So holy war seems a contradiction to many people. They feel that killing large numbers of people could not be justified. So during the Crusades in the 11th to 14th century, both Christians and Muslims were fighting against each other, and they both believed that God was on their side. So this is the idea that you're fighting and it's justified by God or on behalf of God. So for Christians and Muslims, a holy war must be declared by a leader, and it must be when that religion is under attack. And people involved in a holy war believe there will be some form of reward, as maybe heaven or paradise. If you look at it today, it's not considered very much by Christians. It's more of a historical idea. Christians are more likely to use arguments to stand up for their faith. And some have seen belief in holy wars as a reason for violence like terrorism. If you look at the example of the Charlie Hebdo attack in Paris, which is also in the textbook in a bit of detail, although many Muslims did oppose the images that the magazine created, they condemned what the attackers did and would have sought other ways to stand up for views rather than seek what would be seen as a holy war, possibly as an excuse for what happened. So it's not something that we really consider today. What we do consider today is the idea in Christianity then of a just war. So a just war it's the criteria when a war is seen as being acceptable or approved of. So some Christians are pacifists, like Quakers, and we'll look at that in a bit of detail. But most Christians will generally agree to war if it meets the criteria of a just war, and we'll look at that in a moment. So it's developed by St. Thomas Aquinas in the 13th century, and he believed that sometimes not fighting could actually lead to greater evil than fighting itself. There's a video link to explore that a little bit more. So a little bit on the criteria for a just war, and we'll come back onto this when we look at lesser jihad in Islam. So the criteria for a just war, so there's a few extra points, but I like to use the term cars to help just focus on 4 of these. So it must have a just cause. So your reason for war must be right. It must also be declared by an authority. It must be a last resort. So you should have tried to resolve the conflict beforehand. And there also must be a reasonable chance of success. So the term cause can help to remember cause, authority, resort, success. So if it does meet these criteria, then a Christian might say actually that war is right or acceptable. A similar idea in Islam is lesser jihad. We've looked previously at greater jihad, which is the internal struggle between right and wrong. Lesser jihad is about fighting, and it obliges Muslims to fight under certain conditions. And these conditions are similar to what we see with a just war. So the criteria are, firstly, it must have a just cause. It must also be declared by a religious authority. It must be a last resort. And rather than think about the reasonable chance of success, the yes is different. So it must be out of self-defense. So cause, authority, last resort, and self-defense. So we'll look at some examples of weapons of mass destruction in a moment. But here's a few arguments on those. So weapons of mass destruction are weapons that cause huge devastation. A positive of them is, and this is a really strong argument, without even using them, they are a good deterrent. If you have them, it stops other countries from attacking you because you have these huge weapons that can cause massive destruction to them. So many people would argue, well, I wouldn't use them, but it's okay to have them as a deterrent. Another argument for them would be that unless every country abolishes them, they're always going to be a threat. So you're better to have them. So if a few countries have got weapons of mass destruction, then you might feel vulnerable if you haven't. So unless nobody has them, then maybe you should have them for your protection. However, a couple of arguments against them. They're expensive. The UK's tried, and the renewal cost is about £97 billion to update and renew them. And also, a very strong argument is that they cause horrific damage and loss of life. The examples of Nagasaki and Hiroshima are examples that show this. The effect, and obviously go in a bit more detail on that, the impact on victims, long-term health issues, the impact on the environment and on countries' stability and infrastructure is massive. So a little bit on nuclear weapons. So since World War II, many rich countries have developed nuclear weapons. There are enough weapons to destroy the world several times over. And an example that we looked at with Nagasaki and Hiroshima. During World War II, America dropped a nuclear bomb on Hiroshima. It killed about 140,000 people. They then dropped another bomb on Nagasaki. Japan surrendered, which ended the Second World War. So Muslim views on weapons of mass destruction. Going back to the live topic on stewardship and caliphs, Muslims are caliphs. They have a duty to protect the world and to work for peace. Again, the idea that life is sacred, innocent civilians should be protected, and so nuclear weapons shouldn't be used because they harm everybody. And a really good quote that we've used quite a few times before, do not take life which Allah has made sacred. That links to that previous point. Some views from Christianity are the sanctity of life. Only God can take life because it's sacred. In the Ten Commandments it says you shall not murder. And also there are a group of Christians that are involved in the nuclear disarmament of nuclear weapons and protest against their use. You could also use the argument of pacifists from Christianity. So a couple of other examples of weapons of mass destruction are chemical weapons. So these contain lethal chemicals that cause death. Since 1993, it's been illegal to make, stockpile or use these. It's believed, though, that they have been used fairly recently in Syria. Biological weapons. These introduce harmful bacteria and viruses into the atmosphere. They cause serious illness and death. They are illegal, but many countries do possess them. So, again, the religious views on weapons of mass destruction in general it's the same sort of idea as nuclear weapons. No religion supports their use. There's a big difference between supporting the possession of them and using them because of the argument of deterrence, but no religion would support their actual use. You have got a 12-mark plan in the booklet to say it is never acceptable to use weapons of mass destruction. And it'd be really good to use some of the arguments in that. So again, in your booklet, there's a few ideas then around pacifism. So pacifism is the idea that it's never okay to use violence. So for pacifists, it's never okay to use violence in war or for any other reason. And a pacifist is just somebody who follows that belief. So during the First and Second World Wars, many people refused to fight. And the term for those people is called a conscientious objector. So somebody who feels it is not right to fight. Now, it wasn't a case that people would just not fight and disapprove of war and have nothing to do with it. So many people who are pacifists will still be involved in supporting others. So if somebody refused to fight, they might take on a non-combatant role, like being a nurse, a cook, a mechanic. A really good example of a pacifist, which I will put a link to on the PowerPoint, is the film Hacksaw Ridge, and even just the trailer. I'll put the link to the trailer on. Desmond Doss, it's a true story. He refused to fight in war in America, but he didn't want to not be involved. He felt it was still his duty to go to war. And so he refused to use a weapon and was allowed to be involved. And he saved, I think it was 77 lives of people by just being there to help others without any weapon to protect him. It's a really good example. And he was a Christian, and it was his Christian faith, and he believed, from what the Bible said about not using violence, he strongly believed he should not kill. So in Christianity, most Christians would agree with the war if it meets the criteria of a just war. They would say, well, if it meets that criteria, then that's okay. One denomination of Christianity, though, the Quakers, disagree with the use of violence, and they never agree that war is ever okay. So some reasons why a Christian would be a pacifist include that Jesus taught pacifism when he said, turn the other cheek. You don't respond with violence. Also when he said, blessed are the peacemakers. And another good teaching is in the Ten Commandments, do not kill. In Islam, not many Muslims are pacifists because of the obligation to fight in lesser jihad. And the instruction of the Quran, fighting has been ordained for you, though it is hard for you. But some Muslims are pacifists because in the Quran it teaches, if peace is offered, it must not be refused. And again, that quote we saw previously, but if they incline towards peace, you must also incline towards it. So you've got an example of Christian pacifist groups and the Muslim Peace Fellowship. I would say focus on the Muslim Peace Fellowship as your example. In the crime topic, I think we focused on them when we looked at the idea of the death penalty. The Muslim Peace Fellowship were against using the death penalty. So use them as an example there and also here with war. If we think about the effects and the consequences of war it has on people, on countries, on jobs, on livelihoods, there are huge effects. We're going to focus mainly on the victims of war. If you imagine, in the UK, if a soldier is killed or injured in war, there are financial systems in place to support their families. They might also receive specialised healthcare, which is supported by charities like Help for Heroes. In your booklet, there are examples when you think about the effects on victims of war, what happens if the main wage earner of the family is killed? What happens if your place of work is destroyed or the water supplies are polluted? There is a good video link that I'll put on where Angelina Jolie meets some children who are victims of war. It's a 10-minute video and it just shows the impact that war has had on them. So why do religions help victims of war? So religious organisations, you only need to focus on one example, like Christian Aid or Islamic Relief. They help victims on either side. It doesn't matter which side you're fighting on. Examples like the Red Cross and Red Crescent as well. Their focus is the sanctity of life and the welfare of humans. It doesn't matter which side you are fighting on, they will help people. And Christians would follow the teaching, love your neighbour as yourself. The idea everyone is everyone else's neighbour. It doesn't matter your race, religion or political beliefs. If you can help someone, you should. And in Islam, Muslims follow the teachings of the Quran. Whoever saved a life, it would be as if they saved the life of mankind. So that's a summary really of the impact on victims. And like I say, you could focus on the Red Cross or Islamic Relief, for example, just one charity. So just going back to the effects of war. So some examples here to support that. So there's a little bit on Christian Aid and Islamic Relief. So you might want to just choose one of them and just bullet point a few things, how they help victims of war. So here, these are just a few other questions that maybe you could be asked or prepared to ask. Thinking things like, what role does religion play in war? Or does religion cause war? So you've got a few arguments to say religion can cause war or not. Is religion the defining factor between sides in a war? And again, some arguments to support and disagree. Again, you could have a 12-mark question asking, does religion help to keep the peace? So arguments on both sides here too. And also, does religion play a part in ending war? So again, lots of arguments to support.